All right, welcome back to Agritalk, and we are still talking about the indigenous food systems, and we are joined by Sarah Kahori, who is an expert in land restoration for climate action. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and just explain to us about land restoration for climate action, what it's all about, so that we can also get back into the food, indigenous food systems.
Maybe we start off a little bit with explaining what I used to do,
yes,
so that we can arrive to today. I am an information systems analyst, and that means we use geographic systems to analyze information. That is map making in an IT forum. Long time ago, I'm sure you have all used maps, and the maps were on paper and they were static. Now, when we talk about geographic information systems, we are talking about having a map inside what we'd call an intelligent system. You can be able to ask this map when it is still in the computer, because those facilities and functionalities are there. You can ask your computer, where is, for example, where are all the men who are below 20? Which county in Kenya has got more men below 20? Where do we have men in Kenya who has got this or that? Where are we projected? So these intelligent systems, we are able to know why, where, what, and what if. And that means it is a tool for decision making. The reason I'm here today is because during that time, we only looked at what we'd call the industrialized agri-systems. We did not think about what we are calling indigenous systems. That is why I am here today, because that restoration option was not incorporating indigenous knowledge. And we are realizing, and FAO has realized, and even the recent UN Food Summit, which took place this year, they realized and acknowledged that indigenous knowledge, you cannot be able to leave it behind. If you're looking at any restoration, you're looking at food security, you cannot leave behind indigenous knowledge. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
All right. And now, even as we are now looking at the indigenous,
yes,
now where we are right now,
yes,
what are some of the ways in which you're incorporating your expertise in
yes,
order to look at the indigenous systems?
First of all, we want to acknowledge that before the industrial systems came in, the African people as a whole, we fed. We were not hungry. We did not suffer the diseases we were suffering today. The landscapes, as we know them today, they were not as degraded then. The indigenous people, they had knowledge of preserving the soil. They had knowledge of conserving the trees. And they also knew that some trees, you don't touch them. You don't cut some trees. That is the indigenous knowledge we want to look at, because the minute you preserve certain species, it means you're conserving biodiversity. So that is the knowledge you want to tap into. Because if they survived then, and now we are talking about climate change, something is missing something. It is that culture, I call it a carpet, is that carpet we are missing. And we need to step on it to go forward. Yes.
All right. Now, let's look at climate change,
yes,
and how it's affecting the food systems that we have.
Yes.
Because climate change is a topic that is discussed all the time.
Yes.
And when we look at also even this year, we started with a drought, a very prolonged drought,
yes,
from last year, spilled over to this year.
Yes.
So how is climate change affecting the food systems?
Climate change is affecting food systems. One, some of the impacts of climate change is global warming. And when it becomes warmer, it means some plants which used to grow nicely. For example, let's give an example of tea. Tea grows in cold places. Now, the minute it starts warming up, it means we are going to have to take up the contour where a tree used to grow. You will find, if, for example, let's give an arbitrary value of between 500 and 600 in meters, trees used to go there. If it becomes warmer, it means you can only now do your tea slightly higher. That means you cannot be able to do your tea as we used to.
Yes.
The other thing is, when the climate becomes warmer, we have more diseases. pests. They become in plenty. So if you cannot grow your tea, whatever used to grow in cold areas cannot grow now. You know, carrots, sukuma wiki, they used to do well in cold places like here in Limuru. When it becomes warmer, it means you cannot do your vegetables like you used to do them before. Now, when pests come in, it means you have to use pesticides to get rid of the pests. And what are we talking about when you use pesticides? We are emitting
Yes.
those chemicals we are using. They contribute to the what we call greenhouse gases. So we can see that climate change is impacting food security, because if you lose your harvest because of a drought, it means you don't have food in your as a country,
Yes.
even at an individual level. So it is affecting food security. Another impact of climate change is flooding. And I'm sure you have seen all over the world, and even here in Kenya, once in a while we get flash floods.
Yes.
What happens when we get flash floods? You had plants this size, all of a sudden
They are
they are
washed
swept.
away. Yes.
If it is animals, have you seen animals being swept by?
Yes.
Yes.
The cows. Yes.
So either way, the extremes of climate change is drought and flooding. It affects our food security.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And now let's move on and look at some of the remedies.
Some of them?
The remedies.
Yes.
The real remedies to the food systems, especially. Well, let us look at Kenya.
Yes.
What are the remedies to this to the food systems that you can say, okay, if we do this,
Yes.
we're going to at least try and correct whatever has been happening.
One of the ways to remedy the impacts of climate change is to restore our ecosystems. And one of the ways to restore our ecosystems, find the first one and most obvious, is to reforest and to afforest, right? That is obvious. The government is doing that. But in between now the government and us, that is where the indigenous food systems comes in.
Yes.
And the reason why they are very important is, one, the indigenous food systems, it's something your grandfather knew and your great-grandfather. They knew these things. They are well-tested knowledge systems. And the reason why they are going to be very impactful is indigenous food systems. One, it's a mindset, and they do not require the kind of industrialized inputs that we require. You talked about managu in your village. Now, do you need to spray pesticide on your managu for it to do well? No.
No.
The saga, the traditional saga, it doesn't require pesticides. All you need to put into the soil is that manure from your chicken and from your goats, right? That means an indigenous food system does not require the inputs that are contributing to the greenhouse gases and inherently contributing to global warming, climate change. All right? Now, the indigenous food systems, these old men and women, they knew that in this region, you plant managu at this time, and then you let them interact with the forest, isn't it? How many, the indigenous people as they call them, most of them live off the forest.
Yes.
They do not destroy the forest. They go and pick the managus, they go and pick the fruits, come out, leave the forest intact, and because it's a natural system,
Yes.
even the seeds which fall from the trees, they are not destroyed. In an indigenous food system, you do not, weed out, for example, the guavas, because the guavas are food for the animals. But in industrialized food systems, you clear those what you call invasive guavas because you want to have a clean forest.
Yes.
What happens? The animals which live in the forest come out to your maize plantations to get food. But if you had left this corridor that was created by nature to take care of the animals, you will not be having the animal-human conflict. There's only human and conflict between animals when they are not fed by their system. But we cleared their system. That is why we are here today. We are saying the industrialized food systems have not taken care of the food security. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for that well-explained point.
Yes.
Now, let's also look at communities that are trying to plant in the forest.
Trying to plant?
In the forest.
Yes.
Because there's a time, I think last month, I was looking at a story where people in Eldoret, there's a community in Eldoret which is planting.
Yes.
They're using the ecosystem of the forest
yes.
to plant their crops there.
Yes.
Is this something that people need to look at, or is it a thing that you would advise people to do?
Now, when we talk about planting in the forest, it will depend on what forest you're talking about.
Yes.
Are you talking about plantation forests, or are you talking about the natural forest?
Plantation forest.
Plantation forest.
Yes.
Now, it becomes a good thing when you're doing plantations, because the first 3 years of a plantation, it's a planted tree.
Yes.
It did not get there by itself. So that is not, it's like natural environment. So it needs human care. The first 3 years, we call it pelis in Kenya. When you do pelis, it assists plantation to take hold. The survival of those seedlings is higher when you have a pelis system, because you're using manure, you're taking care, so the plantation does better. And if you're going to have plantations, because we need those trees for paper, we need them for building materials sometimes. So a country that needs paper is not going to depend on the indigenous forest, because we don't want to destroy the indigenous forest. We need this fast-growing light wood. Yes.
All right. Let's move on to another issue. When you speak about food systems, of course, we're speaking about also food security, which you mentioned.
Yes.
And when you speak about food security, we're looking at malnutrition.
Yes.
And malnutrition levels, I mean, they are very low, and especially among kids between 0 to 5 years.
Yes.
Many of the children in that age really get affected by malnutrition.
Yes.
And their numbers are very high.
Yes.
So how do we look at food systems and try to correct them in order for us to reduce malnutrition?
One, we need an education. And I think we are going to talk about re-education, because we are not bringing in anything new.
Yes.
We are bringing in what your grandmother practiced. Now, I told you that indigenous food systems, the first thing is a mindset. These days, these young ladies, you tell them to cook managu for their children, they think chips and chicken is better. But your grandmother and my mother, they know that if you do unga ya kusiaga, where you have not removed anything, that is the most nutritious thing, as opposed to, and I have nothing against these people who sell the sifted flours, but we're talking about nutrition. And that is why currently the government has said you must beef up the packets of unga. You must show what you have added. Why? Because it was removed. So we're talking about a mindset here. How are we going to convince our young mothers that when you eat the ugali nyeusi, it is more nutritious than ugali pure white?
Yes.
We're also going to teach them in indigenous food systems that the more natural, the non-refined foods is what is good to the body. It is what, even, the more refined foods you eat, the more you haribu your gut biome, your gut health. So we need to re-educate, tell them what our grandmother knew about the natural food systems, the fermented uji, the non-refined unga, unga ya brown, hata kama ni chapati. How many people like white chapatis? Everybody. They say it looks more beautiful, it is more tastier, but
the brown
what about the health? So that's why we want to take people back. We need to change their mindset. We need to educate them. And we also need to tell them, sometimes it is more healthier, not sometimes, always. It is better you eat that saga, which has got a few weevils, or the spinach, which has been touched by a few weevils, because what is touched by a weevil, that is healthy, as opposed to this 1 foot spinach, which is very beautiful looking, but it is beautiful looking because pesticides have prevented aphid from touching it. That's the education we need. Yes.
Wow,
Yes.
that's. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yes.
And when we look at even the systems, the food systems, and going back to the indigenous kind of food systems,
Yes.
how easy is it to convince people? Because many people have been brought up, especially when you look at the middle age.
Yes.
Some people who grew up in urban areas.
Yes.
They were not used to the indigenous types of maybe vegetables like nsaga,
Yeah.
like managu,
Yeah.
like terere.
Yes.
Many of the people are used to cabbages and kales.
Yes.
How do you convince someone to look at this other side and say, okay, this is the way to go?
Now, the good thing is there is so much education that is available. And like there's a saying that you can take a cow to the river, but you cannot force it to drink water. The thing is, me and you, we are educating people. We are giving them the facts, the nutritional values, the impacts of good feeding, healthy feeding. And we're not saying you cannot eat the white stuff. But we're also telling them, eat your white ugali, but mix it with the vegetables that have got value. That is what we are trying to teach people. And as much as they'll not take it up in 1 week or 1 month, I'm telling you slowly but surely, in 2 years' time, the narrative will change.
Okay.
It's education, education, education.
So it's creating awareness and repeating it and making sure that it gets to someone.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much for that. And let us look at land restoration. You're an expert in this.
Yes.
Now, how do we restore our lands? Because our lands are full of chemicals. They are full of the toxins from spraying,
yes,
and the pesticides. So when we want to make our land back, just to restore it back to the nutritional value that it had, what needs to be done in order for even us also to grow crops that are more nutritious than what we are used to?
One, first of all, what we need is to admit or to accept that we don't want to plant now and become a millionaire in 6 months' time. Because that's the reason why this use of fast, those pesticides and,
yes,
and liquid fertilizers. There are some farmers, you spray your sukuma wiki and it looks very nice. Now, we need to admit that we need to go slower. Because indigenous food systems, once you use manure, it will not sprout as quickly as when you use these other ones. But we must also admit that we need to use friendly inputs. That's what we're calling them. Use manure from your cows. Use manure from your goats and hen. And let us also know, the more we spoil the environment, that is education. And we're not going to get tired. We're going to tell our farmers the benefits of using natural systems that take care of themselves, that are resilient, right? That will take care of the greenhouse gases that we are emitting. Because everybody must be told, climate change is real if we do not halt the destruction of the ecosystem. So landscape restoration must be there. We must go. Some of the things must be natural. The minute you reforest or a forest, it means that soil is taken care of. It is held. It is not going to be taken away by water. It is not going to be blown away by the wind. And when rain falls, when you have forests, the water seeps down, is purified before it gets run off into the river.
Yes.
That means it's going to be filtered. So those are some of the landscape restoration options we're talking about. 2, kitambo, if you go to a virgin area, and when I talk about a virgin area, huku nyumbani, where there isn't a lot of, not like where we've farming down to the river.
Yes.
If you go to that natural system, there is always a natural river line vegetation. So what are you saying here? We are writing policies that you must conserve 3 meters from the river. But nature knew about that. It's unwritten laws from nature. So what we are saying is, when you have that vegetation, you allow that vegetation to protect the river from encroachment. You're conserving the environment.
Yes.
You are conserving biodiversity. Let me tell you something. Why we want to go back to indigenous food systems to combat climate change. Look at the kind of pesticides we are using. I don't know, you might not be aware of that, but you go to these farms where they are spraying day in, day out. Not a single bee visits those farms. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Because
yes.
the bees, they know that is poison.
Yes.
So,
and bees help in pollination.
Pollination.
I mean. Yes.
So when we talk about going back to that, because when you don't pollinate, it means we are missing something. And some of those plants, we are losing biodiversity by using pesticides. And when you lose biodiversity, it's one of the contributing factors to loss of certain very important species, whether in animal or the fauna and the flora. Yes.
All right. Also, how do we strengthen resilience when it comes to soil health, when it comes to biodiversity that you've spoken about? How do we maintain this, and how do we even make sure that at least we're not swayed away? Because, you know, consistency really helps.
Yes.
But now, how do we make sure that we are on the right track when it comes to restoring land, when it comes to biodiversity, making sure that at least food systems are on the right track?
Nationally and internationally,
yes,
like the recent food summit which was there, they acknowledged that you must include the indigenous people's knowledge. You must include their knowledge in policy and decision making. That means once they are incorporated, it's, you know, the first track was do not leave anybody behind, including the indigenous. Now, when you include the indigenous knowledge and the people, it means now you own it back. You know, when you have a foreign kind of an idea and it's brought to you and you don't own it, it doesn't go anywhere. So now, when we start with the indigenous, slowly but surely, that consistency you're talking about, because the indigenous people, the indigenous knowledge, they hold it dear. It's not temporary for them. It's not it's not a fashion. It is ingrained into their systems. And nature appreciates, survives on, and we call it a symbiosis of ecosystems.
Yes.
They live from one another. And that is what now, even FAO, UN has admitted, for us to go forward, the indigenous knowledge and the people must be there. So that way, consistency is going to be there.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. And even as you've said about the UN and FAO, of course, these are big organizations. When you look at the government, our government, the government of Kenya, what are some of the policies that can be put in place or they can come up with in order for this to move forward?
Oh, the policies are in place. They are in place. For example, using the UN forest tools, I was there. I was part of the team, and we reported we have got acts which are addressing the Vision 2030, the Forest Act. They are there. And it is now under implementation.
Okay.
The thing is, you know, when implementation happens like partially, when you don't involve the people on the ground, that is when implementation on the ground does not become, you know, how is synonymous with them.
Yes.
But now they are going back to the roots, and that's why we are here with the African indigenous food systems, because we want things to start from the people who know what is right on the ground, and then it flows out to the policymakers. Yes.
All right, even as we come to the end of this conversation, the Africa Food Systems Expo 2023 is going to happen in November. So what are we looking at after such an event, after such an expo has happened? what are some of the projections that you would give us, that you expect from this expo?
After the expo, I don't expect it to be a 1 month affair. We intend to have what you've just been asking. How are we going to make sure that it continues? We want to start courses. We want to build capacity. And we want to build capacity. I'm sure we already, Dr. Joki said that we have Caro on board and other organizations who are interested in restoration. That means we are going to have courses, impact knowledge, tell the people what to do. And we have got very many, what we are calling like research plots. We are going to show people we are not just preaching theoreticals. This is practically what can happen. And once people see that it's happening, I'm sure from the Expo 2023, we are going to pick from there. So it's a long term. We're not going to end in 2023. We expect this to continue and grow and empower people from the ground. Yes.
All right, your parting shot, even as we close, your parting shot, any encouragement to people who are watching, and what you think the indigenous, going back to indigenous food systems, can do to improve food security in Kenya?
One, if you go the indigenous way, it means you will always have something to eat. Because the indigenous food systems isn't just about growing, it is also about how you eat. Kitambo, we never used to have food wastage. No. We also had preservation knowledge. For example, the Kikuyus, they would put, after the meat has been roasted, it would be put in honey, and for 3 years, that meat was still good. Now, we've had droughts in Kenya where we lose animals. Supposing we use that, we know we have what we call co-sharing of information. Instead of letting the animals from the Maasais, instead of letting them die of drought, how about we harvest them, you preserve them? Even the Luos have got ways of preserving the meats, for 2 years, for 3 years. And the minute you put it back to the pot with water, it is fresh. So we need to go back to the indigenous food systems, because if you have your dried meat, a whole 3 cows, Nyakundi, will you go hungry? No, you won't go hungry. So we want people to change attitudes, eating attitudes, storing attitudes, conservation attitudes. And that is where we're going to have conservation of the environment and food security. We must attain it. Otherwise, we shall be in danger.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us on Agritalk. There you have it. That is Sarah Kahori, who is an expert in land restoration for climate action, speaking to us about climate change and how going back to the indigenous food systems is going to help us even move forward and maintain food security within our country. We've come to the end of this conversation. My name is Kelvin Nyakundi. Stick with us right here on KTN Farmers TV. This is Agritalk.